It's June 30th, 2022. I'm Todd Dunn, and today I'm aboard my 1972 Allied Princess 36 Sequester for another video in my series on buying an old fiberglass sailboat. And today what I'd like to do as a follow-on to my last video where I talked about the hull is I'm going to talk about the deck. And the format for today is going to be a few minutes explaining a little bit about deck construction, and then we're going to go up on deck and have a look at some of the places where you might have issues and what to look for and how to find those issues. So let's get going on deck construction. Okay, how is a deck built? Well, decks are normally built for most fiberglass boats in a mold, which is, if you will, a mirror image of the deck, including the cabin house and cockpit, tow rails, cockpit seats, etc. And the normal method is to wax the mold, and then we lay down the gel coat, which is going to be the outermost surface of the deck. If the boat has contrasting color non-skid, the mold will be masked and the contrast color will be sprayed in directly onto the mold. And the masking will be removed, and then the base color for the deck, which in most cases is white, will be sprayed on over the top of everything. So you end up with white with the colored non-skid embedded in it when you pop the deck out of the mold. Once the gel coat is in, there'll usually be a layer of chopped strand mat set in polyester resin, and then a layer of some sort of fiberglass fabric. And older boats like this one, it's probably woven roving, a very coarse but strong fiberglass fabric. In a newer boat, it might be a somewhat more complex, multi-layered textile, but that's only going to show up in boats built from about the mid to late 80s on. So if you're looking at a 60s or 70s vintage boat, you're probably going to look at the bulk of the fiberglass in the deck being either chopped strand mat or woven roving. Once that is put in, core will be added. Now, with the exception of a very small number of boats built in the early 60s, pretty much every old fiberglass sailboat has a cored deck. Now, those older boats, basically from the first 8 or 10 years of fiberglass boat construction, may have a solid fiberglass deck with no core, which is a plus because there's no core material to become delaminated or to rot in the case of balsa core or anything like that. But in order to make the deck adequately stiff, the fiberglass has to be built up quite thick, and that makes the deck heavy, which weight higher up in a boat does decrease stability. So that is a good thing, because it cuts down on a lot of the problems we're going to talk about with decks in a little bit, and a bad thing because it does negatively affect the stability of the boat. Anyway, core is laid out on top of the fiberglass fabric, bonded to it, often with a putty made up of chopped up fiberglass and polyester resin. And then over the top of that is a layer usually of chopped strand mat, and then another layer of woven roving, and depending on the boat there may be an additional layer of chopped strand mat, and that builds up the structure of the deck. And once the fiberglass cures, the deck is removed from the mold and placed onto the hull. Now, most hulls will have a flange of some sort, either an inturned flange where the hull comes up and there's a flange angled toward the inside of the boat, or an outturn flange going to the outside of the boat. And the deck will then be mated with the flange. Depending on the builder, it may simply be set in some sort of caulking compound, and in the case of the cheapest boats, simply screwed to the hull using self-tapping screws. And in the case of better boats, it will be through bolted on a regular interval, the full length of the perimeter of the deck, usually 6 to 8 inch spacing for the through bolts, which go through both the deck and the flange in the hull, and it draws the two pieces of fiberglass together. Now, the best boats will have a layer or two of polyester saturated chop strand mat set on the flange. The deck where it mates with that will be wetted out with polyester resin, and the deck will be set down onto that saturated chop strand mat, and that will fiberglass bond the deck to the hull. And then the deck will be through bolted, usually on about a 6 inch spacing, with bolts that go through the deck, through the flange, and clamp the two parts together. And that provides a very good bond between the hull and the deck, and the fiberglass layer between the hull and the deck also provides a nice seal, so in the best case you won't get any leaking on the hull deck joint. Okay, so that's the basic structure of a deck. And now let's go up on deck on this boat and look around, and we'll look for some of the potential problem areas that you want to look for if you're looking an old fiberglass sailboat over, in terms of what the condition of the deck is. Okay, here we are on Sequester's deck, which is a pretty typical deck for an old fiberglass sailboat. And you can see the contrast color non-skid I was talking about. That color is gel coat that was sprayed directly into the mold, with the white color every place else. Now, what are we going to be looking for on a deck in terms of potential problem areas? Well, the obvious place to look is any place there is a penetration through the deck, because a deck penetration provides a possible area for water to get into the structure of the deck. So let's back up here a little and just take a look at Sequester's deck and where we might find potential issues. Sequester has a fiberglass bulwark, 2.5 inches high, and here's a track for the general car. Every one of the bolts that goes through that is a through bolt and is a potential leak point. Here's a stanchion for the gate, and each of those screws holding the stanchion down is a through bolt and a potential leak point. This cleat has 2 screws that go through the deck, another couple of leak points. And here are some of the most problematic spots on a lot of boats. That's a chain plate that the standing rigging is attached to, and as a consequence, chain plates get a lot of loads on them, and they tend to move around a little bit. These chain plates go through the deck and are bolted to fiberglass knees inside the boat, but where they pass through the deck is an area that's prone to leaking. There's a deck fill. Actually, in this case, that's the pump out for the holding tank, but it's a hole in the deck that's sealed with caulk, and another 4 potential leak points. And you can get the point here. Here's a solar vent that goes through the deck, and another potential leak point. Similarly, where the solar panels there are mounted, potential leak points.
Now, Sequester has a deck step mast. The mast step is bolted to the deck with through bolts, and those are potential leak points. And where the wires that come down the mast penetrate the deck are potential leak points. Where the hatch here is attached to the top of the cabin house is a potential leak point. The portholes are potential leak points. We come up forward. We've got some mooring cleats. They get highly stressed. They're potential leak points. And a number of other fittings here. The windlass, that can get a lot of stress on it. Another potential weak point. Basically, every place that you have a penetration through the deck or a screw going into the deck is a potential weak point. Another area which is prone to delamination is any relatively wide, comparatively flat space like this. Now, this is balsa cord, but because it's fairly big and people walk on it, it is a potential area where people walking on it will cause it to flex up and down, and that can cause delamination. So that's something you want to watch for. Okay, I think I've made my point of where to look for potential problems. And what you want to do when you're looking for problems on a deck is do a couple things. Walk around on the deck. When you get into a relatively large flat area, like up here on the foredeck, bounce up and down. See if it feels springy. If it does, then, well, you may have some delamination that you might have to deal with. And you also want to take your plastic mallet or plastic screwdriver handle and sound the deck. In other words, tap it every couple inches over its entire surface, and see if you find any dead sounding spots. If the fiberglass is in good shape, any core under it is in good shape, there's no delamination, you'll get a nice sharp tap. And if it isn't in good shape, you'll get a much deader sounding tap. And that is an indication that you might have some water in the hull. If you have access to a moisture meter, it's a good idea to go over the deck and make moisture readings, not for the absolute numbers of the moisture readings, but for relative numbers. You might find some areas, say around the chain plates, where the moisture readings are much higher than in areas away from the chain plates, and that might indicate that you've got some water intrusion into the deck and possibly into the core. Now, normally there won't be any core in things like the cabin sides or any vertical surfaces like the bulwark here on this boat. It does not have core, it just relies on the shape for its rigidity. Now let's go aft and take a look at the cockpit. Any place where you have a highly stressed penetration is a real candidate for a potential leak. Winches, and where those winches are bolted through the deck with through bolts, those are possible leak areas that need to be checked out thoroughly. And an area that's prone to delamination and etc. is often the cockpit sole, particularly if it's a boat like Sequester with a deck step mast, where there are bolts that go through the cockpit sole. You may end up with some water intrusion into the core, and because the cockpit sole and the seats will be cored, the aft end of the cabin house and the vertical sides of the cockpit well won't be cored. But any place where if the cockpit sole feels springy, or if there are penetrations, like this cockpit sole has two cockpit drains, which are potential leak areas, and the bolts that hold the mast step in place, that are also potential leak areas. So you want to check all those areas for indications that there might be leaking. And you want to look for things like, is the cockpit still springy, and does you get a nice sharp sound when you sound it, etc. So those are some of the things you want to look for. And the main problem with the deck of an old fiberglass sailboat is all of the little penetrations through the fiberglass. You can see there are tons of little snaps on here because this boat used to have a full cockpit enclosure. All of those spots are potential water intrusion spots, and if they're in areas that are cored, which is pretty much any horizontal flat surface, then you may have some issues with damage to the core. So decks need to be looked over very carefully, and you just have to be fairly fussy about looking them over to see if there are suspect spots. And I suggest that you do some of this yourself as much as you can, because that'll allow you, while you're looking a boat over, to determine if it's a boat you even want to make an offer on it. If you find that it's got a really springy foredeck and lots of dead sounding areas, say around the chain plates, you may have significant delamination and wet core issues that you may not want to deal with. Now, the other kind of deck that you'll find on some boats, particularly boats that may be built in the 60s, that have a nice fiberglass hull, is that they may have basically a wooden deck. Normally, the deck isn't going to be a traditionally laid deck. What it'll be is a wooden deck structure built from plywood that maybe has a layer of fiberglass over the plywood. Now, this kind of deck is fine as long as no water has gotten through the fiberglass layer into the plywood. But as you saw on my boat, there are literally hundreds of potential leak areas, and you can have some very serious issues on a fiberglass wooden deck on an old fiberglass sailboat. And unless you don't find those issues, I personally would walk away from a boat with a plywood deck that's just been glassed over. It could be fine, but there's an excellent chance that there will be issues on a 50-year-old boat, and the only repair to that is to essentially build a new deck, which is a very big job and very expensive. Another potential problem area on an old fiberglass boat for its deck is a teak deck. Teak decks are usually just an overlay of teak planks that are attached to the underlying fiberglass deck. And in an older fiberglass boat, like we've been talking about, each of those little teak planks will be screwed down to the fiberglass. And there will be literally hundreds of screws holding down the teak deck. Now, teak decks are beautiful, they're functional, they are very good non-skid, and they're very nice. But in an old fiberglass boat, the teak can get worn, the bungs over the screws can give up, and then you have hundreds of potential areas for water to get into the structure of the deck. Now, this is a newer boat here. This is an Alarian 33, and its teak decks are glued down. There are no screws holding this teak deck down. And this kind of deck does not present a problem for water intrusion. But on any boat older than about 1990, if you have a teak deck, it will be screwed down to the underlying fiberglass, and you really need to inspect the teak deck very carefully to make sure that there aren't literally hundreds of leaks into the fiberglass structure of the deck. Okay, so that finishes up what I wanted to say about decks. It's not much, but it does give you something to consider when you're looking at an old fiberglass sailboat. So if you enjoyed this, please give me a thumbs up, and if you haven't, why don't you consider subscribing to my channel? Thanks for watching.